The Hollingsworths were a family unlike any other. For generations they lived in a mansion high on Ashthorne Hill, surrounded by wealth, silence, and whispers. Yet their legacy was not one of heirs, but of absence. They raised children who never lived, and they mourned sons who never marched to war. Their halls were lined with portraits of faces no one had ever seen, and their nursery echoed with cries no one had ever heard. Guests dined beside empty high chairs, servants hushed phantom sobs, and graves were filled with names carved into stone, though no bodies lay within. This is not just a story of madness, nor merely of lies told too long. It is the tale of how illusion became reality, how belief etched itself so deeply into walls and records that the house itself remembers. The Hollingsworths may be gone, their bloodline ended, but the shadows of their children remain, lingering still in the mansion that will never forget. Sorry for the interruption. Where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments. The Hollingsworth estate stood like a monument to sorrow on the crest of Ashthorne Hill. Its looming towers and ivy-choked walls seemed less like the work of architects and masons, and more like the product of grief itself, solidified into stone. The house did not welcome, it warned. At dawn, its silhouette cut across the morning fog, casting long shadows down into the valley. By night, its windows glowed faintly, not from lanterns or candlelight, but with a dim radiance, as though the house itself was alive, watching. Locals avoided the hill after dark. They said voices carried on the wind from the upper floors, whispers and faint laughter, the kinds of sounds one would expect from children at play. But the Hollingsworths, through all their years in that house, had never once produced a child. No births, no baptisms, no cries of an infant carried down the halls. The contradiction unsettled the townsfolk, and in time, the Hollingsworth estate became the subject of countless fireside stories. The nursery windows were the most infamous. Travelers passing through Ashthorne swore they saw shadows moving behind the lace curtains, tiny silhouettes dancing and waving as if eager to be seen. On stormy nights, some claimed to hear the rhythmic creak of a rocking chair carried down the hill, the faint sound of a lullaby sung in a woman's trembling voice. It was said that if you listened long enough, the melody would unravel into sobbing. The Hollingsworth family never denied these stories. In fact, they seemed to encourage them. When asked about the voices, the matriarch Eleanor Hollingsworth would offer a tight smile and say, "The house is never empty. It never has been." No explanation followed, and none dared to press her further. But it wasn't only the voices. The estate had an atmosphere that clung to all who entered it. Guests often spoke of an invisible weight pressing down on their shoulders the moment they stepped across the threshold, as though unseen eyes studied their every move. Rooms felt colder than they should have, even in the heart of summer. The air carried a faint sweetness, like fading perfume, but beneath it lingered something acrid, something like mildew and rot. Those who stayed too long in the house left changed. Some suffered recurring dreams of cradling children who vanished from their arms. Others reported waking in the night to the sensation of small hands tugging at their blankets, or the sound of childish giggles fading into the corners of darkened rooms. Few ever returned a second time. And yet, for all its dread, the Hollingsworth mansion endured. It rose from Ashthorne Hill like a mausoleum for the living, a place where laughter and crying were heard, though no children were ever born to give those sounds a source. The house remained, brooding and patient, as if keeping its secrets until the world was ready to understand them. For generations, the Hollingsworth name endured without ever producing an heir of flesh and blood. The family line was long, the estate sprawling, yet no infant's cry had ever echoed through its chambers. Husbands and wives came together, grew old, and died within those walls. But not once did a Hollingsworth woman carry a child to term. No cousins from neighboring branches, no distant kin brought into the fold, only a lineage of hollow inheritances passed from one gray head to another. Yet, despite this absence, the family lived as though surrounded by children. It was not enough to quietly conceal their barrenness. They chose instead to flaunt a world of heirs who had never drawn breath. They organized christenings, complete with reverends and gilded fonts of water. Guests stood in hushed reverence as invisible infants were blessed, their names etched into family Bibles with solemn care. When no child was lifted for all to see, no explanation was offered, and none dared to ask. The deception did not end there. Each year, the estate rang with the trappings of birthdays. Servants carried tiered cakes into dining halls, lit by hundreds of candles. High-pitched songs of celebration filled the air, sung with forced cheer by society elites who would not risk offending their wealthy hosts. Gifts were wrapped and stacked beside empty chairs, ribbons and lace, carefully tied as though small, eager hands would tear them open at any moment. The Hollingsworths clapped, laughed, and toasted to the health of children who were never present, raising crystal glasses to names that belonged only to shadows. In time, even milestones of education and adulthood were staged. Announcements of graduations appeared in local papers, praising achievements at schools the supposed children never attended. Invitations were sent for grand dinners to honor sons and daughters entering society, though the chairs reserved for them always remained empty. Portraits appeared on the walls, oil paintings of fresh-faced youths in academic robes, bridal gowns, and military uniforms. The details were painstaking: the gleam of metals, the curve of a smile, the softness of a gaze. Yet not a single neighbor could recall ever meeting the subjects in real life. The townspeople, though unsettled, played along. To challenge the Hollingsworths was to risk banishment from their gilded circles. So guests toasted invisible brides, shook hands with absent grooms, and signed their names to guest books that recorded events which had never occurred. Over time, truth and illusion blurred, and the family's charade became less a deception and more a tradition. In the end, the Hollingsworths became a family defined not by the children they bore, but by the children they pretended into existence. Their legacy was not flesh and blood, but echoes and shadows, an entire lineage of lives that never were, yet were celebrated as though they had been. The hallways of the Hollingsworth estate told a story no living soul could verify. Each wall was lined with grand oil portraits, gilded frames polished so bright they caught the flicker of candlelight like fire. The subjects were children, dozens upon dozens of them captured in stiff poses that betrayed the skilled hands of master painters. Some were depicted as infants swaddled in lace, others as bright-eyed toddlers clutching toys, while still more appeared as stern young scholars, their gazes fixed with unnatural maturity. Yet for all their lifelike quality, no one in town could recall ever seeing these children in the flesh. Beneath each portrait hung a small brass plaque, engraved with names and dates as carefully as if carved onto gravestones. Each plaque told a life story: a year of birth, an age at the time of the portrait, and sometimes even the year of death. The timeline of a family that had never existed, unfolded across those halls, childhoods that never were, youths that never grew, deaths that were never mourned. It was as if the Hollingsworths had conjured an entire dynasty from smoke and pigment, determined to preserve a heritage that only their walls could confirm. Visitors found the portraits deeply unsettling. The eyes of the painted children seemed to follow them down the corridors, wide and unblinking, as though desperate to be acknowledged. Some swore the expressions shifted ever so slightly when viewed at different times of day: smiles that wilted into frowns, blank stares that turned accusatory. Servants who passed through the halls at night reported whispers rising from the canvas, faint murmurs that grew louder when ignored. Many would hurry their chores to avoid lingering too long in those galleries of silence. And yet, the Hollingsworths treated the portraits with reverence. Dust never gathered on the frames, and fresh flowers were placed beneath certain paintings as though offering tributes to loved ones long gone. Eleanor Hollingsworth was often seen pausing before one portrait of a young boy, her hand pressed to the glass, murmuring as though speaking to a child who stood on the other side. At family dinners, toasts were raised to the names engraved beneath the paintings, spoken with the gravity one might reserve for the dearly departed. In time, the portraits became more than just decorations. They were the family's proof, their evidence of a lineage no one could disprove. To question them was to invite scorn. To deny their existence was to be cast out of Hollingsworth favor. The children on those walls were never born, but within the confines of the estate, their presence was undeniable. The painted eyes bore witness, the plaques etched permanence, and the illusion of a family thrived in brushstrokes and brass. The Hollingsworth estate was never quiet, not even in the dead of night when every lamp was extinguished and the town below lay still in its slumber. Servants spoke in hushed tones of the strange noises that carried through the halls, sounds that had no earthly source. Toys could be heard rolling across wooden floors, the hollow clatter echoing down corridors where no children had ever played. Rocking chairs creaked rhythmically as though cradling an unseen child, the steady groan of the wood rising and falling with the tempo of a lullaby. And always, there was the singing soft voices in the dark, the kind of lullabies a mother might murmur to soothe a restless infant. The words were never clear, but the melody was unmistakable, gentle, comforting, terribly wrong. Some servants tried to explain it away at first. Old houses, after all, had a way of speaking on their own. Wood warped. Winds whistled. Animals scurried within the walls. But the Hollingsworth home was different. These sounds were too deliberate, too human. The clinking of marbles rolling across the nursery floor did not scatter randomly, but followed the distinct rhythm of a child's play. The rocking chair's cadence did not falter like a piece of furniture swaying in a draught. It moved with intent, pausing as though a lullaby had ended, then beginning again with the next verse. Those who had to tend the upper floors dreaded their duties. Maids would refuse to pass through the nursery hall alone after dark, insisting on pairing up for even the smallest tasks. Some claimed they felt cold, small fingers tugging at their skirts, or the sudden weight of a hand pressing into their own. More than one servant quit their position outright, unable to endure the constant sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. The Hollingsworths, however, dismissed their fears. When asked about the disturbances, Eleanor Hollingsworth would simply smile and say, "The children are restless tonight." The family behaved as though the noises were not only real, but expected. If the sound of a ball bounced down the staircase in the middle of supper, the patriarch would pause, tilt his head as though listening to a familiar call, and then continue dining as if nothing were amiss. Guests found this impossible to ignore, yet none dared to question it aloud. To do so would be to break the unspoken pact. One either accepted the existence of the unseen children or risked falling out of favor with the family. Over time, even the townspeople grew accustomed to the rumors. They would say the Hollingsworth mansion never slept, that the children of the house played long after midnight, filling the great halls with the echoes of lives they never lived. For those who worked or visited there, the nights became a blur of half-seen shadows, half-heard laughter, and a chilling certainty that the Hollingsworths were not alone, no matter what reality suggested. Eleanor Hollingsworth ruled her household with an authority that was equal parts elegance and severity. She was the matriarch, the keeper of tradition, and the one most devoted to ensuring that the illusion of the Hollingsworth children never faltered. Her presence alone could silence a room. With her sharp eyes and rigid posture, she gave the impression of a woman who would tolerate nothing less than absolute obedience. Yet it was not fear alone that bound the family and the servants to her will. It was the strange, unwavering rituals she performed in honor of children who did not exist. At every dinner, no matter how intimate or grand, high chairs were arranged neatly around the table. Their polished wooden frames gleamed in the candlelight, and upon each one rested a silver spoon and a plate of fine porcelain, as if waiting for tiny, eager hands. Eleanor oversaw every detail herself. If a servant set a spoon at the wrong angle or left a chair askew, she corrected it with her own hands, muttering that the children must be treated with respect. Meals were served not just for the living but for the unseen, platters of roasted meats and sugared fruits portioned into bowls that no lips would ever touch. When guests attended these elaborate feasts, they were expected to play their part. Eleanor would introduce the children by name, gesturing gracefully toward empty spaces as though her brood sat before her in flesh and bone. She might laugh softly, chiding an absent boy for poor manners, or lean in tenderly to wipe a smudge of food from a face that wasn't there. The guests, faces pale and smiles stiff, were forced to nod along, sometimes even speaking into the air as if acknowledging the invisible children themselves. The most unsettling moments came when Eleanor led toasts. She would rise from her seat, glass raised high, her voice steady with pride, as she praised her sons and daughters for their accomplishments, recounting milestones that had never occurred. She spoke of academic achievements, musical talents, and virtues of character, her tone filled with such sincerity that even the most skeptical guests found themselves doubting their own disbelief. In those moments, it was as though Eleanor's conviction breathed life into shadows, making the absence feel like a presence pressing in on every side of the room. To the servants, these rituals were not mere eccentricities, they were obligations. They were required to pull out chairs for the unseen, to pour drinks into untouched goblets, and to bow their heads when Eleanor prayed over her children. Any hint of hesitation was met with her icy glare, a look that conveyed both warning and command. Through these dinners, Eleanor ensured the Hollingsworth legacy endured. She transformed the dining table into a stage where fantasy masqueraded as truth, where silver spoons and empty chairs testified to a lineage the world could neither confirm nor deny. And in the flickering glow of candlelight, with glasses raised to lips that were never there, the family's hollow traditions grew heavier with each passing year. Those invited to the Hollingsworth estate knew the rules long before they stepped through its heavy oak doors. Attendance was not merely a social courtesy, but a necessity, for to decline an invitation from Eleanor Hollingsworth was to risk exclusion from the highest circles of society. The Hollingsworths, after all, were wealthy, influential, and deeply respected. To offend them meant losing access to fortunes, marriages, and opportunities that only their favor could unlock. And so, the elite of the county played along with the most unsettling theater ever staged within four walls. At dinners and soirées, the guests learned to act as though the invisible children were present among them. They bent low to greet thin air, whispering soft compliments as though addressing toddlers in their best dresses or miniature suits. Some even mimed the gentle patting of a child's head, their palms brushing through nothingness, the movement carried out with smiles that were brittle and strained under the flicker of candlelight. The laughter that followed was hollow, ringing against the marble walls like a prayer said without belief. Eleanor watched these interactions closely. She expected enthusiasm, not hesitation. To falter in the charade was to draw her suspicion, and more than one unfortunate guest who dared to question the ritual found themselves quietly cast out of future gatherings. Whispers traveled quickly through the town of those who had offended the Hollingsworths' families, who saw their businesses falter, engagements mysteriously dissolved, and invitations to other society homes vanish overnight. It became clear that the safest course was to nod, to smile, and to pretend. For some, the pretense began to blur into something more troubling. When forced to raise a toast to children whose names were engraved on plaques yet never spoken outside the estate, guests found themselves stumbling, their minds grasping at the unsettling thought that perhaps they had simply forgotten meeting them. The painted portraits on the walls gave the illusion of memory, convincing enough to unsettle even the strongest skeptic. And when Eleanor spoke of each child's supposed accomplishments, her voice brimming with motherly pride, a flicker of doubt took root in the minds of those seated at her table. Could it be possible that they had overlooked these heirs, that their absence was the fault of memory rather than fact? But deep down, every guest knew the truth. They knew they were actors in a play scripted by a family determined to preserve a bloodline that had never truly existed. They clinked their glasses, forced their laughter, and joined in songs of celebration for children who were nothing more than shadows. In the Hollingsworth mansion, survival in society required surrendering to the lie. And under the heavy gaze of the matriarch, every guest performed their role, their smiles frozen like masks in the glow of the candlelight. Beyond the sprawling gardens of the Hollingsworth estate, past the iron gates wrapped in ivy, lay a place few dared to enter. It was a private cemetery, hidden from the view of passers-by but known well enough to those who whispered about the family's strange ways. The ground was marked not by grand mausoleums or ornate crypts but by a field of small headstones, each one aligned in precise rows, each one bearing the name of a Hollingsworth child who had never taken a single breath. The headstones were crafted with meticulous care, carved from pale marble that glistened even in the dimmest light. Names were etched deeply into the stone: Charlotte, Henry, Isabella, Thomas, and beneath them, dates of birth and death that sometimes spanned no more than a single day. Some bore epitaphs that read as if the children had been cherished and lived brief but meaningful lives. Others carried simple inscriptions, nothing more than a name and 2 dates, the markers of lives that had never truly existed. Visitors who wandered too close to the burial ground often left unsettled, unable to reconcile the sight before them. Dozens upon dozens of graves, all belonging to children no one had ever seen. No local doctor recorded their births, no parish held their baptisms, and yet here they were, memorialized in stone as though they had been loved and lost. The townsfolk whispered that the Hollingsworths held funerals with the same gravity and sorrow as any grieving parents. Coffins were lowered into the earth, prayers were spoken, and tears were shed. But when the mourners left, they carried with them the heavy silence of doubt, for they could not recall ever laying eyes on the bodies said to rest in those tiny graves. Eleanor Hollingsworth, the matriarch, was often seen in that cemetery. She would kneel at the foot of certain headstones, arranging flowers with careful precision, her lips moving as though speaking softly to the child beneath the soil. Sometimes she lingered for hours, unmoving, her black dress blending with the shadows of the trees that surrounded the graves. Servants reported that she would return from these visits with red-rimmed eyes, as if she had truly been weeping for a child she lost. The cemetery became one of the estate's darkest symbols, a place where illusion was carved into permanence. Unlike the laughter in empty nurseries or the portraits staring from the walls, these stones could not be explained away as tricks of the mind. They were solid, enduring, undeniable. Each grave stood as a testament to the Hollingsworth obsession with children who never lived. And as the years passed, the rows multiplied, a growing army of marble markers standing in silence behind the house, each one anchoring a name to the earth, as though the family believed that carving it in stone could make it real. Among the relics of the Hollingsworth family, one discovery stands apart from rumor and speculation, a piece of evidence that revealed how carefully the family wove their strange illusion into the fabric of reality. It came in the form of a set of journals, belonging to a physician who served the estate during the height of its influence. Bound in cracked leather and yellowed with age, the pages offered a glimpse into the quiet torment of a man trapped by wealth, power, and fear. The physician, a respected man in his community, had been called to the estate countless times to attend the supposed births of Hollingsworth children. His journals, written in a hand that grew shakier with each entry, told a story that contradicted every public record. He wrote of evenings when he was ushered into dimly lit rooms where Eleanor or another Hollingsworth matron lay in bed, pale and weary as though having endured a long labor. Servants bustled about, carrying linen stained with something meant to mimic the aftermath of childbirth. And then would come the announcement of a name, a son or daughter, added to the growing lineage of Hollingsworth heirs. But there was never a child. "They bring me no children, only names," he confessed in one trembling entry. The words carried the weight of a man haunted by complicity. He detailed how he was instructed to sign birth records, his reputation ensuring the documents would go unquestioned. For every false entry, he was paid handsomely, more than enough to ensure his silence. Yet guilt gnawed at him. His notes grew more frantic over the years, his sentences fractured, his handwriting jagged as though his very hand recoiled from the truth he was forced to put to paper. The doctor described how he sometimes heard the sounds of infants crying elsewhere in the house, though no child had ever been placed in his care. He admitted he would wake in the night with phantom echoes ringing in his ears, unable to tell if the cries were dreams or something far more sinister. In his later entries, he wrote of seeing shadows in the nursery hall, the outline of small figures darting across candlelight, gone the moment he turned his head. His rational mind rejected these visions, but his guilt twisted them into something he could no longer dismiss. When the journals were uncovered decades later, they were treated as both scandal and mystery. Here was a respected physician admitting, in his own words, to perpetuating a lie that spanned generations. Yet even his confessions left questions unanswered. Did the Hollingsworths simply invent their heirs for power and appearances? Or had something been present in that house, something unseen, something that made even a man of science doubt what his own eyes told him? Whatever the truth, the physician's words remain etched in history like a final plea. They bring me no children, only names. The nursery sat on the second floor of the Hollingsworth estate, a room that seemed preserved in a perpetual state of waiting. Visitors who were allowed inside described it with voices lowered to whispers, as though speaking too loudly might awaken something they could not see. Sunlight streamed through tall windows draped with lace curtains, falling across cribs of polished wood and shelves stacked with porcelain dolls, tin soldiers, and plush animals. Rocking horses stood as if poised mid-gallop, their painted eyes catching the light in unsettling ways. Everything was immaculately arranged, never a toy out of place, never a sheet wrinkled. What struck visitors most was not the abundance of objects, but their condition. Dust never settled upon them. Months could pass, seasons could change, yet the embroidered baby clothes looked as though they had been folded just that morning. The brass rails of the cribs gleamed without polish, and the rocking chairs swayed faintly, as though someone had only just risen from them. More than one guest claimed they felt a shift in the air as soon as they crossed the nursery's threshold, as though the room itself breathed differently from the rest of the house. The Hollingsworths would usher society elites into the nursery as proof of their happy brood. Eleanor would gesture toward the cradles with maternal pride, her voice warm, speaking of babies asleep just beyond sight. She would lift a bonnet from a drawer or run her hand over a rattle, as though each object carried the presence of a child who had only stepped away. And the guests, bound by the weight of reputation, would nod, smile, and sometimes even lean over the cribs to murmur soft greetings into the air. But whispers followed them once they left. Some swore they heard the faint cry of an infant while standing in the room alone, only for the sound to vanish when they turned toward the cradle. Others described the sensation of being watched, not by Eleanor or the family, but by something smaller, lower to the ground, something shifting just beyond the reach of vision. One guest, writing years later, claimed he had seen a doll move on its own, its porcelain head turning slightly as if to follow him with its eyes. Another admitted she had found the hem of her gown tugged gently while she spoke to Eleanor, only to look down and find nothing there. These stories were dismissed in public, but in private, they fueled the unease surrounding the Hollingsworths. The nursery became a symbol, not of innocence, but of absence, an emptiness so carefully maintained it grew into something else, something palpable. Toys untouched yet worn smooth, cribs that rocked without a hand, clothes prepared for children who never came. A room full of shadows, waiting, as though it believed the children it was made for might one day return. The servants of the Hollingsworth estate carried the heaviest burden of its secrets. While guests came and went, smiling politely and playing along with the family's peculiar rituals, it was the maids, footmen, and butlers who lived among the strange rhythms of the house day after day. Their testimonies, passed down in hushed recollections long after they left service, painted a picture far darker than the polite facades witnessed at dinner parties or soirees. Maids often spoke of being summoned in the middle of the night, the bell in the servants' quarters ringing insistently. When they arrived at the appointed room, they expected to find a restless child or anxious parent, but instead they were met with silence. The air would feel heavy, charged, as though a presence had only just departed. The beds would be rumpled, cradles swaying gently, or toys scattered across the carpet, though no one had touched them. More unsettling were the cries themselves, thin, high-pitched wails that echoed through the hallways. The servants swore these cries came from empty rooms, and they often found themselves shushing at shadows, whispering lullabies to corners of darkness because their employers demanded it. Some lasted only weeks before leaving the estate altogether, unable to endure the nightly terrors. They returned to their families, pale and shaken, warning others never to seek work at Ashthorne Hill. Yet others stayed, whether out of loyalty, desperation, or fear of losing the generous wages the Hollingsworths provided. For those who remained, obedience became a shield. They learned not to question why high chairs were cleaned daily, or why laundry baskets filled with baby linens appeared, though no child had ever soiled them. They learned to nod when Eleanor spoke of restless nights with her little ones, and to pretend they too had heard the footsteps of children running in the halls. One maid, recorded years later in a parish ledger of oral histories, confessed that she once felt a tug on her apron while she bent to straighten a rug. Thinking it a prank by one of the younger footmen, she turned quickly, only to find herself alone. Another told of seeing indentations on freshly made beds, as though small bodies had lain there moments before. These stories grew in number and detail, until they formed a tapestry of fear woven through every corner of the servants' wing. The butler, a stern man named Whitcomb, endured the longest of them all, though even he admitted in later years that the house had a way of breaking the will. "You do not work for the Hollingsworths," he once said. "You work for the children that are not there, and somehow they make you believe they are." His words became the quiet truth behind the family's grandeur. It was not only the Hollingsworths who upheld the illusion, but those who served them, whispering lullabies into emptiness, too afraid to ask who or what they were truly comforting. In the patriarch's study, buried among ledgers of estate accounts and correspondence with bankers, there existed a book that few were ever permitted to see. Bound in dark leather, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling, this volume was unlike any other. It was not a record of crops, nor contracts, nor debts owed. Instead, it was a ledger of names, a family chronicle that catalogued the lives of Hollingsworth children who had never been born. The book was meticulously organized, written in the same careful hand that had been passed from one patriarch to the next. Each generation added to it, beginning with a name chosen before the so-called birth was ever announced. Beneath the name came dates of birth and death, christenings, and accomplishments, all recorded with unwavering precision. Some entries spanned only a few lines, noting a child who died in infancy. Others stretched across entire pages, detailing imagined schooling, marriages, and careers, as though the family had constructed entire lives on paper for their invisible heirs. One entry described a boy named Samuel Hollingsworth, who was said to have attended Cambridge, returning to the estate at the age of 30 to manage its affairs. Yet Samuel never walked through the halls of Cambridge, never held a book in his hand. Another spoke of Margaret Hollingsworth, whose portrait hung in the west corridor, painted in a white dress with violets at her shoulder. Her biography spoke of charity work in the local parish, her death at age 22 from a fever. Yet no parish record mentioned her. No grave marked her passing. And her portrait, though lifelike, depicted a face no one in town had ever seen. What disturbed those who glimpsed the ledger was not only the detail, but the tone. These were not fanciful tales told to amuse. They were presented with the authority of truth, written in the same solemn style one might use for royal genealogies. Margins bore notes of marriages that never took place, connections to noble families that did not exist, as if the Hollingsworths believed the weight of ink could transform lies into history. Servants who stumbled upon the ledger described an unease that clung to them long after they closed its cover. One maid claimed she heard the faint scratching of a quill continuing to write even after the book was set aside. Another said she saw a page turn of its own accord, revealing the name of a child she had never heard spoken in the house. Rumors spread that the ledger itself had grown too full of invention, that it no longer required a patriarch's hand to sustain it. The book was more than record, it was declaration, obsession, perhaps even a contract with forces unnamed. Within its pages, generations of children lived and died, their existences confined to ink and imagination, yet haunting the estate as though they had been flesh and blood. To read it was to step into a world the Hollingsworths had crafted, one where the line between truth and invention had long since dissolved. Each summer, as the gardens of Ashthorne Hill bloomed in riotous color, the Hollingsworth estate prepared for its most elaborate tradition. Invitations were sent weeks in advance, sealed with wax bearing the family crest. Carriages from across the county lined the drive, bringing society's finest in gowns of silk and coats of velvet. They came not for a wedding, nor an anniversary, but for the grandest and strangest of gatherings, the banquet of birthdays. The ball was held in the great hall, where chandeliers glimmered like constellations above long tables draped in linen. At the center of the room stood an arrangement of chairs, smaller than the rest, each one adorned with ribbons of blue or pink, their places set with fine china and silver. Around these empty seats the festivities unfolded, for they were reserved for the Hollingsworth children who were never there. Guests played their roles with studied grace. They arrived with gifts, carefully chosen for boys and girls who did not exist, dolls with glassy eyes, toy soldiers, books of fairy tales, and tiny garments folded neatly in embroidered boxes. Each present was presented with ceremony, laid upon the table before the waiting chairs, as though invisible hands might reach out to unwrap them. The Hollingsworths accepted these offerings with solemn gratitude, speaking the names of the children aloud, ensuring each one was acknowledged. The centerpiece of the evening was always the cakes. Enormous confections, layered with cream and sugared violets, were wheeled into the hall, candles blazing as if to honor a multitude of young faces. The family would lead the crowd in song, voices rising in cheerful unison, though the air trembled with unease. When the candles were blown out, no cheeks puffed, no laughter followed, yet slices were cut and served, each plate carried first to the empty chairs before the guests were allowed their share. Toasts were raised, champagne glasses clinking as speeches praised the accomplishments of children who had never taken a step. "To Henry, may his studies bring him glory," one uncle would declare. "To Charlotte, whose grace shines upon us all," another would add. The guests smiled, lifted their glasses, and drank to shadows. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned into the illusion with practiced ease. For to mock the ritual was to risk exile from society's most influential circle. And so, year after year, the tradition endured. Music played, couples danced, and laughter mingled with the silence of absent children. By dawn, the hall stood littered with wrapping paper and crumbs, as though a true celebration had taken place. Yet the chairs remained untouched, the gifts unopened, the feast shared only by those willing to believe or pretend that the Hollingsworth children had been among them all along. The Hollingsworth legacy had always depended on silence, on the willingness of neighbors, servants, and even guests to play along with the peculiar fiction of children who never lived. But silence is a fragile thing, and once broken, it has a way of echoing louder than truth itself. The one who threatened to shatter it was a distant cousin, a young man whose bloodline gave him just enough claim to be taken seriously, but not enough to shield him from reprisal. His name, once spoken in family circles, has been lost. That is not an accident. For what remains of his existence is not in records or portraits, but in fragments of rumor, carried forward by those who remembered too well the cost of disobedience. The cousin had attended one of the summer banquets, watching with poorly disguised contempt as toasts were raised to empty chairs. He saw the cakes sliced for children who were not there, the presents piled high for invisible hands. Unlike the others, he did not lower his eyes, nor force the smile society demanded. Instead, he began asking questions. Why were there no parish records of these births? Why had no doctor other than the family's chosen physician ever attended? Why did the so-called children leave no trace outside the estate? His words unsettled the guests, drawing nervous glances from across the hall. Some attempted to hush him, urging discretion, but the cousin pressed on. By the end of the evening, he had declared that he would expose the charade, that the Hollingsworths had deceived society for generations. For a moment, there was silence, thick and suffocating. Then, Eleanor Hollingsworth herself rose, her expression composed but her eyes burning with a fury no one present would ever forget. She said nothing. She did not need to. The cousin left the banquet with his pride intact, but his fate sealed. Within days, he was gone. His room stood empty, his possessions packed away as though he had never lived there. Some claimed he had departed in haste, fleeing disgrace, while others whispered he had been taken in the night. What made the matter more chilling was the thoroughness with which his existence was erased. His name was struck from the ledger in the patriarch's study. His portrait, once hanging in a narrow corridor, vanished. Even servants who had spoken his name daily found themselves hesitant to repeat it, as though some unseen weight pressed upon their tongues. The town quickly learned not to ask after him. When his absence was mentioned, the Hollingsworths responded with blank stares or polite denials, as though no such cousin had ever been born. Those who pressed further spoke of an unease that followed them home, of shadows moving in their periphery, of voices whispering in the dark. It was as if the very act of remembering him drew the attention of something that wanted him forgotten. And so his name dissolved into silence, buried as completely as if he had been laid in one of the tiny graves behind the estate. To this day, the story lingers like a warning. In the house of the Hollingsworths, to question the children was not only dangerous, it was to invite erasure, body and soul, until nothing remained but silence. The Hollingsworth obsession did not end with births, christenings, or birthdays. As the imagined children were given lives in the ledger and spoken of in the halls, so too were they granted futures. For a family so determined to uphold their illusion, even marriage was not beyond invention. And so began the hollow weddings ceremonies crafted with all the splendor of society's finest unions, yet with no bride or groom to be found. The earliest whispers came from photographs, faded images discovered in private collections or tucked away in dusty albums. At first glance, they seemed like ordinary wedding portraits, guests arranged in neat rows, tables overflowing with flowers, and elaborate cakes rising tier upon tier. But look closer, and one detail struck the eye with chilling clarity. The spaces reserved for the bride and groom were empty. Chairs sat unoccupied, bouquets of roses rested in vacant hands, and in some frames, arms of smiling relatives curled protectively around nothing at all. Guests of those strange events later confessed, though only in hushed voices, that the ceremonies had been carried out with uncanny precision. Vows were spoken aloud, though no voices answered. Rings were lifted, slipped into the air, and clinked as though striking against invisible fingers. Champagne was poured, toasts raised, and dances performed to honor couples who had never existed outside of the Hollingsworth imagination. Those who attended played along, their forced laughter echoing uncomfortably in the grand halls, because to refuse was unthinkable. To deny the presence of the invisible bride or groom was to insult the family and risk banishment from their powerful circle. Yet the photographs betrayed the truth. Technology was impartial, capturing not the illusion the Hollingsworths insisted upon, but the stark absence at the center of it all. What made the images more unsettling was their composition. It was as if the camera itself had been arranged to acknowledge the void, framing empty spaces with deliberate care. In one particularly infamous photograph, the wedding party stood smiling beneath a grand arch of roses, two spaces in the center held open. A pair of bouquets laid gently on the ground as though cradled by unseen hands. Historians who studied these photographs describe them as the most haunting artifacts of the Hollingsworth legacy. Unlike the ledger of names or the portraits painted by artists willing to imagine faces, the photographs offered no interpretation, no embellishment. They showed only what was there and what was not. The hollow weddings became a mark of how far the family's obsession had spread, transforming absence into spectacle. They were not merely preserving the illusion of children, but carrying it into adulthood, forcing the world to witness unions between shadows. And though the photographs endure as proof of something grotesque, they raise questions no one dares answer. Were the Hollingsworths staging a performance for power's sake, or were they recording unions with something unseen, something the camera could not capture but which the family believed was undeniably present? Beneath the sprawling mansion of Ashthorne Hill lay a crypt that few outside the family had ever seen. The entrance was hidden behind a heavy oak door in the cellar, its iron lock older than memory itself. Those who were permitted below spoke of a chill that clung to the stones, an air that seemed older than the house above it. It was here that the Hollingsworths kept their most unsettling secret, a burial place for children who had never lived. The crypt stretched in long, narrow corridors, its walls lined with alcoves. In each alcove rested a coffin, small or large depending on the imagined age of the child it claimed to contain. The coffins were carved of wood polished to a gleam, adorned with brass plaques engraved with names and dates. Each one belonged to a Hollingsworth heir who had never drawn a breath, yet who had been given the dignity of eternal rest. To stand among them was to walk through a lineage of phantoms, a gallery of lives written in oak and brass rather than in flesh and blood. Servants who once carried lanterns into that place swore the silence was never complete. Some spoke of faint tapping that echoed from the sealed coffins, as though something inside sought to be heard. Others reported the sound of sighs, too soft to mistake for wind, rising from the darkened rows. One maid, trembling in her old age, confessed she had seen the lid of a coffin shift slightly as she dusted the plaques, though when she fled and returned with others, it was closed tight once more. The most disturbing detail was that the coffins were sealed. They were not empty boxes placed for show, but nailed shut and bound with iron clasps, as though the family feared something within them might escape. No one ever saw a body laid inside. The ceremonies were private, attended only by the family, and when the servants returned, they found the coffins already in place, wreaths of lilies resting on the lids. What unsettled those who discovered the crypt years later was its completeness. Generations of false heirs were entombed there, row after row, as though the family believed that to bury the children was to give weight to their existence. It was not enough to name them, to paint them, to celebrate them. They had to be mourned, entombed, remembered as though their absence were flesh that could rot. Standing in that crypt, one could almost believe the Hollingsworths had succeeded in binding their illusion to stone. The coffins gave the children permanence, a place in the earth, a silence that seemed alive. And perhaps that was the most terrifying truth of all, that the family did not simply pretend. They buried their lies so deeply that even the dead were made to share in the deception. The reverend's confession did not surface in his sermons, nor in the open air of the pulpit, but in the dim chamber of his rectory, when his body was failing, and his voice trembled with the weight of truths long hidden. He had served the parish for more than 50 years, a man once respected for his steady hand and even steadier faith. Yet, as his health withered and his days shortened, he summoned a trusted parishioner to record what he called the blackest stain upon my soul. It was not a crime of blood, but of silence and complicity, his role in the baptisms of the Hollingsworth children who had never been born. He wrote that it began innocently enough, when Eleanor Hollingsworth first came to him. Her face pale with exhaustion, her voice thick with what seemed like genuine grief. She told him her child had survived but a single day, and though the infant's body had already been prepared for burial, she begged that it be baptized. The reverend, sympathetic and fearful of denying a grieving mother, agreed. He was led into the Hollingsworth chapel, where the air smelled of lilies and melted wax, and there, before a marble font, he performed the rite. He remembered reaching out, expecting the weight of a child in his arms, but finding nothing. Still, Eleanor wept as though her child had been saved, and he told himself grief made people see what was not there. But the requests continued. Each season, the family brought him new names, new infants to bless. He would be summoned at dawn or near midnight, the chapel lit with candles, the Hollingsworths gathered solemnly around. He wrote of dipping his hand into the water, tracing the sign of the cross into the air above an absence, whispering holy words that seemed to dissipate before they left his lips. He would declare the child baptized, even as his hands remained empty. At first, he told himself it was symbolic that perhaps the children had been lost before he arrived, and his role was to comfort the family, not question them. But the pattern grew darker. He was never shown a body, never heard the weak cry of an infant, never saw the small movements of life, only names, pressed upon him like sacred burdens: Henry, Charlotte, Samuel, Margaret. Each one inscribed in the parish book with his own hand, though he knew they were nothing more than shadows. His writings revealed the depth of his fear. The Hollingsworth fortune was vast. Their influence rooted deep in the foundations of the parish itself. The church's steeple had been rebuilt with their gold, its windows adorned with their stained glass. To refuse them, he wrote, would have been ruinous not only to himself but to his congregation, who depended upon their patronage. And so he complied, year after year, though every baptism hollowed his faith a little further. What haunted him most were the sounds. More than once, as he stood at the font, he swore he heard the faintest splash, as though water touched a brow he could not see. He felt his fingers brush against something soft and fleeting, like wisps of hair or skin not quite solid. Once, after baptizing a child named Lillian, he claimed he heard a gurgling laugh echo in the chapel, though the air around him remained empty. His pen trembled when he admitted this, for it suggested that perhaps something did answer his rites, something that was never meant to be sanctified. By the end of his life, the Reverend could no longer bear the silence. His confession poured out like blood from an old wound, staining his final days. "I baptized shadows," he wrote, "and in doing so, I lent them the weight of the church. I feared wealth and lost my soul. I gave names to things that were never born, and yet I fear they are with us still." His words, sealed in the parish archives, were found decades later, but by then, the damage had been done. The names he had inscribed remained in church records, indistinguishable from those of true parishioners. The Hollingsworth children, though never seen, had been woven into the faith of the town itself, their baptisms recorded in ink and sacrament. And so the Reverend's fear lived on, that in blessing nothing, he had blessed something, and that the water, the prayers, and the cross had not vanished into emptiness, but into waiting shadows eager to be claimed. When the Civil War tore through the land, sending families into mourning and fields into ruin, the Hollingsworth estate remained untouched in ways that seemed unnatural. While neighbors spoke in hushed, grief-stricken tones about their boys fighting in distant fields, the Hollingsworths stood tall and proud, boasting of sons they claimed to have sent to war. They spoke of valor and sacrifice, of uniforms buttoned and muskets polished, of tearful farewells beneath the grand portico of their mansion. Eleanor Hollingsworth in particular was fond of reciting letters she said had been sent from the front, her trembling voice carrying stories of courage, suffering, and loyalty to the Confederacy. These letters, she insisted, were written by her own blood sons who carried the Hollingsworth name into battle. At first, the townsfolk believed her. Why should they not? The Hollingsworth family had always been pillars of standing, and their wealth afforded them a kind of moral immunity. But as the years dragged on, whispers began to form. No one had ever seen these sons in uniform, marching off with the other young men of Willow Creek. No recruiters remembered their names, no regiments had them listed, and no graves bore testimony to their supposed deaths. Still, Eleanor and her kin held their heads high at memorial services, draping themselves in black veils, mourning sons no one else could recall meeting. The townspeople grew uneasy. Yet they did not challenge the illusion openly. To do so would have been to risk their place in the tightly woven social web the Hollingsworths controlled. Instead, they exchanged quiet glances, muttered suspicions over pews, and turned their doubts into questions left unspoken. How many sons were there supposed to be? 5? 6? The number shifted depending on the story Eleanor told. Sometimes she would speak of Thomas, the eldest, who had perished at Antietam. Other times, she mentioned Samuel, brave and unyielding, fallen in Virginia. Each name was carried with such conviction that even skeptics felt a pang of guilt for doubting. Still, the inconsistencies piled up. At the courthouse, where official records were kept, no Hollingsworth sons were listed among those conscripted. Their names never appeared in newspapers that dutifully chronicled the local dead. When one widow asked Eleanor if her boy had fought alongside her claimed sons, Eleanor's reply was vague, her gaze sliding away as though chasing a memory that did not exist. Yet, as with so many of the family's inventions, the lie was performed so thoroughly that it gained a strange sort of permanence. The mansion itself played its role in the charade. Eleanor kept a room draped with military banners, its walls lined with polished sabers and rifles that had never seen use. Portraits were commissioned of young men in gray uniforms, their faces resembling the other painted children that lined the halls half-formed, unsettling, familiar only in that they belonged to no one real. The servants were instructed to speak of the boys with reverence, to set extra places at dinner as though they might return at any moment from the battlefield. Guests at the estate found themselves compelled to nod and smile, to toast the bravery of men they knew had never lived. But the most chilling detail came after the war ended. While other families bore the scars of loss, withered from grief, or stood hollow at the absence of sons, the Hollingsworths thrived. Their fields were untouched, their fortune intact. They continued to speak of sons who had died in glory, their sacrifice supposedly ennobling the family name. Yet no pension papers arrived, no widows came knocking, no relics of service buttons, boots, or blood-stained letters ever surfaced. The townsfolk, bound by fear of the Hollingsworth power, played along, offering condolences at anniversaries, bowing their heads when Eleanor whispered of the boys' gallant ends. And yet, beneath it all, a gnawing dread spread like rot. If these sons had never lived, what then had Eleanor buried in the family cemetery? For years after the war, fresh headstones appeared, etched with the names of soldiers who had never marched, never fought, never died. The ground behind the estate filled with empty graves, each one marked by marble and reverence. And the town, silenced by the weight of the Hollingsworth wealth, could only watch as the family continued their ritual of loss, mourning shadows, grieving for sons who had never drawn breath, and draping themselves in the dignity of sacrifice that was no sacrifice at all. It was not until more than a century later that the strange fabric of the Hollingsworth family story began to unravel under the cold, unyielding gaze of historical research. The man responsible was Dr. Jonathan Reeves, a meticulous historian whose life's work had been tracing the lineage of old Southern families. He was neither a sensationalist nor a seeker of ghost stories. Reeves prided himself on accuracy, on grounding his work in the solidity of paper, ink, and signatures. It was this devotion to detail that brought him, inevitably, to the Hollingsworth name. The Hollingsworths had always been spoken of in half-myth, their fortune whispered about but never entirely understood. To Reeves they were simply another wealthy family to document, another line to follow through census records, parish registries, and public archives. But the deeper he dug, the stranger the story became. In census after census, stretching across the 19th century, he found the same perplexing detail: long lists of children dutifully recorded under the Hollingsworth household. Names filled the pages, dates of birth meticulously noted, ages progressing neatly with each decade's entry. On the surface, it looked like a family bursting with heirs. But when Reeves compared these names to the parish baptismal records, an unsettling void appeared. Not a single Hollingsworth child was ever baptized in Willow Creek's church, though other families' entries crowded the pages. He moved on to school rosters, expecting to find traces of their education. Again, nothing. Teachers had never marked their attendance, never graded their handwriting, never spoken their names aloud. Reeves then checked marriage licenses, obituaries, and society logs, all the places where families of standing inevitably left their footprints. But the Hollingsworth children existed only on census sheets, their names etched in neat ink and nowhere else. The more Reeves uncovered, the more bizarre the pattern grew. Each supposed child seemed to have lived a full paper life, but only on government records. Their existence evaporated the moment one looked for them in the living world. It was as though the Hollingsworths had woven a careful illusion, ensuring their phantom heirs were always counted, always present on official lists, yet carefully shielded from every other form of verification. Reeves shared his findings cautiously at first, fearing ridicule, but his colleagues, hardened researchers themselves, could not dispute the facts when shown the documents. Census after census bore names that the parish, the schools, and the town had never known. Reeves described it as a kind of bureaucratic haunting the state, acknowledging children the earth never carried. What disturbed him most, however, was the precision of it all. The ages matched perfectly across decades, the handwriting consistent, the fabric of the lie maintained without falter for generations. Late nights in the archives left him unsettled. He admitted in his journals that, at times, he felt as though the records themselves were alive, whispering from the faded ink. There was an eerie rhythm to the names, a symmetry that seemed too careful to be mere invention. Some part of him wondered if the Hollingsworths believed, truly believed, that by inscribing their children into official records, they had willed them into existence in some unseen realm. Perhaps that explained the baptisms, the portraits, the graves. It was not enough to imagine they needed the world itself to bear witness, even if that witness was paper and ink. Reeves published his findings in a quiet academic journal, expecting little notice. Instead, it ignited a storm of fascination and unease. Historians debated whether it was fraud, delusion, or something darker. Locals who had long buried their unease felt vindicated. The Hollingsworth estate, already a relic, drew new attention from those who wished to see the place where census records and empty nurseries collided. For Reeves, though, the discovery never lost its chill. He had set out to study a family, and instead he had uncovered a labyrinth of names belonging to no one. It was as if the Hollingsworths had raised entire generations on paper, families of ghosts carefully etched into history's ledger, daring anyone centuries later to tell them they were not real. The story of the Hollingsworths reached its strange and sorrowful conclusion with the final couple to bear the name. By the early 20th century, their wealth had dwindled, their estate weathered by time, and their influence a faint shadow of what it had once been. Yet even as their power slipped away, the old tradition, the lie, the ritual, the haunting performance of family persisted. And so, in the waning years of their line, they announced the arrival of a son. His name was Alistair. As with those before him, no doctor delivered him into the world. No nurse swaddled him, no parish bells rang in celebration of his baptism. Yet to the Hollingsworth couple, he was as real as any child could be. The nursery, long kept pristine for heirs that never came, was prepared anew. Toys were purchased, fine wooden horses, gleaming tin soldiers, and puzzles carved with precision. Tiny garments were stitched and embroidered with the initials A.H. The crib, draped in lace and linen, stood waiting for the weight of a baby who would never stir within it. Servants, by then few in number, were summoned to hush phantom cries, to warm bottles of milk left untouched, to fold clothes that would never be worn. Some obeyed out of duty, others out of fear, and still others because they had lived in the house long enough to feel that perhaps, in some inexplicable way, there truly was a child whose presence lingered just beyond the reach of sight. Whispers spread of toys shifting on their own, of a rocking horse creaking at night, of laughter faint as wind echoing through the nursery. Alistair became the last phantom child of Ashthorne Hill. His birthdays were celebrated with quiet gatherings, his presents stacked neatly in the corner of the nursery where dust refused to settle. The couple spoke often of his progress, of his lessons, of his talents. They described his curls, his voice, his favorite games, and though no one saw him, they insisted he was there. As the years passed, their stories grew richer, Alistair growing older in their words, though never in the eyes of the world. When at last the couple passed away, first the husband, then the wife, the estate fell silent. Their graves were dug beside the generations before them, and their stones marked the end of the bloodline. No heirs came forward. No distant cousins claimed the property, and the name of Hollingsworth faded into memory. Yet within the house, the nursery remained. Alistair's toys still sat in their places, waiting for hands that never played with them. His clothes lay folded, his crib made as though for a child returning from a nap. Visitors who came after swore the room felt different from the others. While the halls below smelled of age and rot, the nursery seemed preserved, its air strangely warm, its silence thick with expectancy. Some claimed to hear faint footsteps on the floorboards, light as those of a child. Others said the rocking horse swayed when no one touched it, as though Alistair himself lingered there, the last hollow child of a hollow family. The Hollingsworth line had ended, but their illusion had not. It lived on in the toys untouched, in the records inscribed with names that never belonged to flesh, and in the memory of a boy named Alistair, who never lived yet never seemed entirely gone. The bloodline died, but the story endured, whispering from the nursery of Ashthorne Hill a final testament to a family who raised children that were never born. The Hollingsworth mansion still looms at the top of Ashthorne Hill, its stone walls cracked but unyielding, its windows like dark eyes watching the valley below. Though time has withered its gardens and collapsed its once proud gates, the house itself refuses to fall into silence. It seems to breathe with memory, as if the family that built it never truly left. Those who pass along the road after dusk speak of shapes flickering behind the windows, shadows small and quick, like children at play. Some say they see hands pressed against the glass, others insist they hear faint laughter carried on the wind. Always, it is the nursery windows where the figures appear most often, the very room where no living child was ever rocked to sleep. The people of the town keep their distance now, though curiosity has drawn a few across the threshold. What they found lingers in their minds long after. Dust chokes most rooms, but the nursery is untouched, its cradle polished, its toys arranged as if waiting for eager hands. Visitors describe an unease that grows the longer they remain, the feeling of being watched by eyes they cannot meet. Some swore they felt the brush of unseen fingers against their sleeves, or heard whispers just beyond the reach of hearing. All of them left with the certainty that the house is not empty, no matter what the records say. The Hollingsworths may have passed into the grave, their line ended and their name fading from memory, but the illusions they created cling to the house. For generations they raised children who never lived, gave them names, stories, and graves, and poured such fierce devotion into their shadows that the house itself absorbed them. The echoes of those imagined children remain, etched into the wood, the stone, and the air. Now, Ashthorne Hill carries both a warning and a legend. The Hollingsworths are gone, but the house remembers. It remembers the children who never were, and it keeps them within its walls. On quiet nights, when the wind stills and the valley lies hushed, their laughter can be heard again, fragile and haunting, proof that some memories never die.